The bulldozer's engine coughed to life, a deep, guttural roar that vibrated through the cracked pavement right into the soles of my shoes. Across the street, my ex-wife, Karen, was screaming at the foreman, her face a blotchy, tear-streaked mess. She flailed her arms, pointing frantically at the small, two-bedroom house behind him, our house. Or rather, what used to be our house. Her voice was lost in the diesel thunder, but I could read the panic in her eyes. She thought some faceless corporation was about to tear down her last remaining asset. She had no idea the order for the demolition came from me. Her betrayal, the one she thought was her brilliant escape plan, had actually forged the key to my victory. She sold our home from under me for a quick, dirty payout, thinking she was cashing in and leaving me with the rubble of our shared memories. What she didn't know was that she hadn't just sold a house. She had sold me the very land her future was supposed to be built on. In her rush for fast cash, she'd missed the fine print, the city zoning changes, the development plans I had spent years quietly researching. She saw a rundown house in a forgotten neighborhood. I saw a gold mine. Now, she was homeless, living out of her car, and I was about to own the entire block. You're probably wondering how one single act of greed could lead to such a total reversal of fortune. How does a man lose his home to the woman he loves only to end up controlling her destiny a year later? To understand that, you have to understand the foundation of lies our life was built on, starting with the day we first stepped foot in that house, full of promises she never intended to keep. It began 10 years ago with a dream. The house was a wreck, honestly. The realtor tried to be diplomatic, calling it a handyman's special, but it was a disaster. The porch sagged. Half the windows were boarded up, and the yard was a jungle of weeds and rusted metal. Anyone else would have run screaming. But I saw past the peeling paint and the water-stained ceilings. I saw the solid foundation, the good bones, and the potential for a life we could build from scratch. It was all we could afford, a forgotten house on a forgotten street. But to me, it was a kingdom in the making. Karen seemed to agree, or at least she pretended to. She loved telling her friends how brave we were, how we were urban pioneers with vision. For the next 5 years, that house became my entire world outside of my 9 to 5. Every weekend, every evening was spent with a hammer or a paintbrush in my hand. I taught myself plumbing from library books and YouTube videos. I rewired the entire electrical system, laid new hardwood floors by hand, and rebuilt the sagging porch with wood I salvaged and restored myself. I remember the splinters, the aching back, the exhaustion that went bone deep. But I also remember the pride I felt looking at a newly installed window or a perfectly plastered wall. I was pouring my soul into the floorboards and foundation. I was building our future. Karen's enthusiasm waned quickly. She loved the idea of a beautifully restored home, but she hated the reality of sawdust and sacrifice. While I was covered in drywall dust, she was often out with her friends, complaining about the noise and the mess. Her parents, Richard and Eleanor, didn't help. They'd visit once a month, walking through the ongoing renovation with thinly veiled disgust. "Still working on this old money pit, are we, Mark?" Richard would say, patting me on the back a little too hard. Eleanor would just sigh dramatically and whisper to Karen about her friend's daughter, who just moved into a brand new condo downtown. They planted a seed of discontent in her, a whisper that I wasn't providing fast enough, that she deserved more now. I was too busy building to see the rot setting in, not in the house, but in the heart of my marriage. The final nail in the coffin of our marriage was hammered in while my own father was fighting for his life. He'd had a massive heart attack, and I spent 3 weeks sleeping on a cot in a hospital waiting room 2 states away, holding my mother's hand and praying he'd pull through. I called Karen every night, exhausted and scared. She was sympathetic, but her voice always seemed distant, distracted. She said she was handling things at home, not to worry. I was a fool to believe her. My father stabilized, and the first thing I wanted was to be home, to find solace in the sanctuary I had built. I turned onto our street, a wave of relief washing over me. I was just feet from my front door when my blood ran cold. There, stabbed into the lawn I had so carefully reseeded, was a sign. It wasn't just a for sale sign. It was a bright red banner that screamed, "Sold." I stumbled out of my car, my heart pounding in my ears, a sick, dizzying dread rising in my throat. This had to be a mistake, a prank, a nightmare. I fumbled for my keys, but they wouldn't work. The lock had been changed. I hammered on the door until she finally opened it. Karen stood there, not with a look of guilt, but with a cold, defiant glare. Boxes were stacked in the hallway behind her. She didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. "What is this, Karen?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What did you do?" She crossed her arms. "I did what I should have done years ago, Mark. I sold it. We're getting a divorce." She said it with the same casual tone she'd used to say we were out of milk. When I asked how she could possibly sell our house without me, she delivered the final, devastating blow. "That power of attorney you signed when you were in the reserves, the one for emergencies, I considered this an emergency. I was tired of waiting for a life that was never going to happen." Her parents had coached her through the whole thing. It was all perfectly legal, a clean, fast cash sale to a developer. She had already packed her bags and her half of the money. I was left standing on the curb, locked out of my own home, betrayed by a legal document I had signed out of love and trust. The days that followed are a gray blur of legal humiliation and logistical nightmares. I met with a lawyer who confirmed what I already knew in my gut. The power of attorney was ironclad. The sale was legal. The developer, a slick man in an oversized suit named Mr. Henderson, wanted the property vacated immediately. Karen had already taken her share, a little more than half, after her lawyer tacked on a list of bogus expenses and reimbursements. What I was left with was a check for a pathetic amount, barely enough to cover a security deposit and a few months' rent on a shoebox apartment across town. It was a sum so small it felt like a final insult, a price tag placed on a decade of my life. I had 48 hours to collect my belongings. She hadn't even packed my things properly. They were just tossed into garbage bags and left on the back porch, a heap of my clothes, my tools, my books, the debris of a dismantled life. As I loaded the bags into my truck, I could see Henderson's contractors already taking measurements inside, their voices echoing through the rooms I had built. They looked at me, not with sympathy, but with annoyance, as if I were a piece of trash that hadn't been collected yet. I didn't just lose a house, I was evicted from my own past. My new apartment was everything my home wasn't: small, dark, and anonymous. The walls were thin, and the air smelled of stale cigarette smoke and regret. Every night, I'd lie awake on a cheap mattress on the floor, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, a cruel parody of the ones I had so painstakingly repaired. The silence was deafening. The betrayal had hollowed me out, leaving nothing but a cold, aching void. Karen had moved on, likely living it up in a fancy high-rise, funded by my sweat and sacrifice. Her parents were probably toasting her brilliance, and I was left in the dark, a ghost in my own story, buried under the weight of an injustice so profound it felt like it could swallow me whole. For weeks, I did nothing but exist, convinced my life was well and truly over. For weeks, I was adrift in a sea of misery. Then, one afternoon, a piece of mail arrived, forwarded from my old address. It was a boring-looking official envelope from the city planning department. I almost threw it away, thinking it was just more bureaucratic salt in the wound. But something made me open it. It was a notice for a public hearing regarding zoning variances for a multi-parcel lot on my old block. It was dry, full of legal jargon, but one phrase caught my eye. Project C7, Transit-Oriented Development. Curiosity, the first emotion I'd felt besides grief in over a month, stirred within me. I spent the next day at the public library, then the city records office, digging into Project C7. The more I read, the more the fog of my depression began to lift, replaced by a sharp, cold clarity. The city wasn't just rezoning a few lots. They were laying the groundwork for a new light rail extension, with a station planned just 2 blocks from my old house. The project had been in the pipeline for years, winding its way through committees, but was finally approved. It was public knowledge, but buried deep in municipal documents nobody ever reads. In 5 years, this forgotten, run-down neighborhood was set to become a prime real estate hub. Suddenly, it all made sense. Henderson, the developer, hadn't just bought my house to flip it. He was a bottom feeder, yes, but he was playing a long game. He was acquiring properties cheap, planning to sit on them until the transit project was officially announced, then sell the entire portfolio to a massive corporation for a fortune. He hadn't just stolen my house. He'd stolen the winning lottery ticket I never knew I was holding. Karen, in her short-sighted greed for fast cash, had handed it to him for pennies on the dollar. A fire ignited in my chest, but it wasn't the wild, destructive fire of rage. It was a cold, controlled burn, a forge. They thought they had left me with nothing, but they had left me with 2 things: a small amount of capital and a crucial piece of information. They had shown me the game, and I decided right then and there I was going to learn the rules and beat them at it. My first move was to become a ghost. I took the bulk of my settlement money, the pittance Karen had left me, and didn't spend it on a better apartment or a new car. I spent it on a lawyer who specialized in corporate law. He helped me form a limited liability company, an LLC. It was the most boring, anonymous entity we could create, Apex Strategic Holdings, LLC. I was the sole silent member. My name appeared nowhere on the public-facing documents. Mark, the betrayed husband, ceased to exist in the world of real estate. In his place was Apex, a faceless firm with a post office box for an address. This was the shield behind which I would wage my war. With the last of my cash, Apex made its first move. I couldn't afford anything of value, so I aimed for the opposite. There was a small, derelict house on the corner of my old block. It was a true eyesore, condemned by the city after a fire years ago. The roof had caved in, and it was surrounded by a chain-link fence covered in vines. It was worthless to a flipper like Henderson, a liability he wouldn't touch. But to me, it was a foothold. It had been sitting on the county's tax auction list for years. No one wanted it. My LLC bought it for the cost of the back taxes, a fraction of what even the empty lot was worth. I spent the next 2 months working on it myself. I wasn't fixing it up to sell. I was securing my asset. I cleared the debris, reinforced the fence, and boarded up the windows with thick plywood, making it look clean and stable, but utterly uninteresting. I did it all after my day job, working under the cover of darkness, fueled by cheap coffee and a burning, singular focus. I was living on ramen noodles in my crummy apartment. pouring every ounce of my energy and every spare dollar into this silent, invisible plan. From the corner, I had a clear view of my old house. Some nights I'd just stand there in the dark, looking at the home I built. The pain was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but it was different now. It was no longer the weight of grief. It was the whetstone on which I was sharpening my resolve. One secured property wasn't enough. I needed to create a fortress. The condemned house, now clean and secured, was more than just a foothold. It was leverage. I put together a business plan, a carefully worded document that laid out a vision for revitalizing the block's most neglected properties. I spoke of urban renewal and long-term community investment. I presented my research on projected population growth in the area, but kept the ace up my sleeve, the light rail project, to myself. Armed with this plan and the deed to my first property as collateral, Apex Strategic Holdings secured a small business loan from a local credit union that was eager to invest in the community. They had no idea they were funding a revenge plot. With a line of credit, my operation accelerated. I became a vulture, circling the neighborhood, picking off the carrion that Henderson, in his arrogance, deemed unworthy of his attention. Apex acquired the failing laundromat on the block, its owner desperate to retire. We bought the weed-choked vacant lot that separated two apartment buildings, a magnet for illegal dumping. I found the out-of-state owner of a rundown duplex who was tired of dealing with tenants and sold it to Apex for a price that barely covered his mortgage. Each transaction was quiet, handled through my lawyer, an anonymous LLC buying up the block's forgotten scraps. While I was working 18-hour days, living off canned soup, and reinvesting every penny, I'd occasionally hear things about Karen. A mutual acquaintance mentioned she'd bought a luxury convertible. Her social media, which I tortured myself by looking at just once, was a shrine to her new life. Photos of her on a beach in Mexico, clinking champagne glasses in fancy restaurants, showing off designer bags. She was burning through the money from our house, living a life of careless indulgence, completely oblivious to the silent, strategic siege I was laying around her golden goose. She and Henderson were both smugly waiting for their big payday from my old house, unaware that I was methodically buying the very ground from under their feet. They thought they owned the jewel, but I was slowly acquiring the entire crown. A year passed, a year of relentless work, of scrimping and saving, of living like a monk while my LLC grew. By then, Apex Strategic Holdings owned the corner property, the laundromat, the vacant lot, and the duplex. We weren't just a player on the block. We controlled the board. The whispers about the city's light rail project were getting louder, and Henderson, smelling the money, decided it was time to cash in. His plan was simple: tear down my old house and put up a cheap 6-unit apartment building. He filed the first round of permits with the city. That's when the ghost known as Apex Strategic Holdings began to haunt him. His application required a temporary easement across the vacant lot for construction vehicle access. My lawyer, on behalf of Apex, sent back a one-sentence reply: denied. A week later, he filed for a zoning variance to build higher than the current code allowed. I put on a suit, walked into the Public Planning Commission meeting as a concerned local business owner representing Apex, and formally objected. I spoke calmly about preserving the neighborhood's character, about potential traffic issues, about the strain on parking, using the system's own language against him. The variance was tabled for further review. Henderson was furious. He started calling my lawyer, demanding to know who was behind Apex. He wanted to know our price. My lawyer was a brick wall. When Henderson's office sent an official offer to buy the vacant lot, we sent back a counteroffer for 10 times the amount. It was a clear message. We know what this land is worth, and we are not your fool. Every move he made, I was there in the shadows to block it. He was trying to develop a property that was now an island, completely surrounded by a sea of my holdings. The carrying costs, taxes, insurance, security were bleeding him dry. The quick, profitable flip he had envisioned had become a stagnant money pit of a problem. Meanwhile, word got back to me about Karen. The convertible was gone. She had reportedly lost a huge chunk of her money investing in a friend's failed boutique. She'd had to downgrade from her luxury apartment to a small rental in a less desirable part of town. The life she'd betrayed me for was evaporating like a puddle in the summer heat. She was beginning her slow, painful descent, completely unaware that the man she'd ruined was the architect of her ex-partner in crime's impending doom. Henderson was stuck. For 6 months, every attempt he made to develop my old property was met with a new bureaucratic wall erected by Apex. The light rail announcement was now official news, and land values on the block were skyrocketing on paper. But his parcel was worthless without the cooperation of its neighbors. He was sitting on a theoretical goldmine that, in reality, was a leaking bucket of cash. His investors were getting nervous, and his frustration had boiled over into pure desperation. He finally saw the truth that I had spent a year carefully constructing. The only entity that could possibly want to buy his landlocked, problem-plagued property was the one that owned everything around it. His call to my lawyer was different this time. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the weary tone of a defeated man. He was ready to sell. He named a price, a hopeful figure based on the neighborhood's future potential. My lawyer, following my precise instructions, let him finish, and then countered with our offer. It was a take-it-or-leave-it figure, brutally low. It was just a little more than what he had paid me for it, allowing him to walk away without a total loss, but cruelly denying him the massive windfall he had schemed for. It was the price of his greed. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, followed by a string of curses directed at the faceless, soulless corporation he imagined Apex to be. But he had no choice. Every day he held onto the property, he was losing more money. 2 days later, a humbled and furious Mr. Henderson signed the sales agreement. The house was mine again. My lawyer called me to confirm the wire transfer was complete. "Congratulations, Mr. Evans," he said. "Apex Strategic Holdings is now the sole owner of the entire block." That evening, I drove to the old neighborhood and parked across the street, just looking at the house. The lights were off. The lawn was overgrown. It looked sad and abandoned. I thought I would feel a wave of triumph, a sense of homecoming. Instead, I felt nothing but a cold finality. That structure wasn't my home anymore. It was a monument to a lie, a museum of betrayal. Every window, every floorboard, every nail I had hammered was tainted by what Karen had done. To truly move on, I couldn't just reclaim the past. I had to erase it. The house had to go. And so we arrived back at the beginning. 2 weeks after I signed the papers, the demolition crew I hired was on site at dawn. I stood across the street, a thermos of coffee in my hand, and watched them set up. The roar of the bulldozer's engine was the sound of a new chapter beginning. Just as I knew she would, Karen showed up. I had heard she was living out of her car, and a friend of a friend had accidentally let it slip that the house was scheduled for demolition. Her desperation was a magnet. And the destruction of her last perceived hope was a flame she couldn't help but fly towards. She screeched to a halt in her beat-up sedan and ran towards the foreman, a frantic, wild look in her eyes. This is the scene I painted for you at the start. Her screaming, the foreman shrugging, the machine inching forward. She was putting on a grand performance for a crew that was just doing its job. After a minute of fruitless yelling, she finally scanned the area, her eyes searching for someone, anyone in charge. And then she saw me. Her face went through a rapid series of emotions: confusion, a flicker of recognition, and then utter disbelief. She stumbled across the asphalt, her expression crumbling. "Mark?" she stammered, stopping a few feet away. "What are you doing here? You have to stop them. This is our house." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth spread through my chest. I looked from her haggard face to the house, then back again. "It's not our house, Karen," I said, my voice even and calm. "It hasn't been for a long time." "But Henderson, the developer," she sputtered, gesturing vaguely. "He can't just tear it down. There's equity." "Henderson sold it," I said flatly. Her eyes widened with a sudden, greedy hope. "To who? We can talk to them. We can explain." I cut her off. "He sold it to a company called Apex Strategic Holdings." She stared at me blankly, not understanding the name. I decided to finally turn on the lights for her. "He sold it to me, Karen." The color drained from her face. The frantic energy vanished, replaced by a still, silent horror as the pieces clicked into place in her mind. "Every letter of objection Henderson received," I continued, my voice cold and precise. "Every denied permit, every roadblock he hit for the last year. That was all me. You sold our house for a quick payout, and you gave me the perfect opportunity to buy the entire block." Karen stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. The reality of her situation was crashing down on her, and it was a tsunami. "No," she whispered. "No, you couldn't have. You're a nobody. You were nothing without me." The disbelief morphed into rage. "You monster! You did this to me on purpose." "You did this to yourself, Karen," I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. "You chose a wad of cash over a decade of my life. You saw a rundown house, but I saw a foundation. You just happened to be the one who handed me the tools to build an empire on the ashes of what you burned down." As if on cue, a luxury sedan pulled up behind Karen's car. Her parents, Richard and Eleanor, got out, looking flustered and angry. Karen must have called them in a panic. Richard, his face red and puffed up with self-importance, marched right up to the foreman. "I don't know who you think you are, but my daughter has a stake in this property." "I'm calling my lawyer." He then spotted me. "And you?" he sneered, pointing a finger at me. "I should have known you'd be here, sniffing around the wreckage like a rat." "Hello, Richard," I said calmly. "There's no need to bother your lawyer. If you have a complaint, you can file it with the owner." "Damn right I will," he boomed. "Who owns this land now? Give me his name." I allowed myself a small, cold smile. "The company is Apex Strategic Holdings. And as for the owner, you're looking at him." Richard and Eleanor froze, their smug expressions melting into the same slack-jawed horror as their daughter. I looked at the three of them, a perfect portrait of greed and consequence. "You called my home a money pit, Richard. You told your daughter I had no ambition, Eleanor. You encouraged her to betray me for a lifestyle she couldn't afford. Well, this money pit is now the cornerstone of a $10 million development project." "My project?" I gave a sharp nod to the foreman. He signaled to the bulldozer driver. With a deafening crunch of splintering wood and shattering glass, the machine's massive steel bucket smashed through the front wall of the living room, the very wall I had spent a month rebuilding. I didn't stay to watch the rest. I turned my back on their horrified faces and walked away, leaving them to choke on the dust of their own creation.